Welcome to Privacy Architecture for Data-Driven Innovation. My name is Derek Kerr. I'm a director from the Privacy and Cybersecurity Legal team at Uber.
Hello there, my name is Nishant Bhajaria, and I head the technical privacy organization at Uber.
And we're here to talk about privacy architecture. Nishant, can you go to the agenda? So we have a lot of ground that we want to cover here, and we want to start by giving you an overview of the privacy landscape for modern companies and what that means from a data collection and handling standpoint. Then we're going to talk about how to deal with data collection and usage and data sharing, and how we architect solutions for those, what the process is, and what technical solutions can be applied to each of these. Then we'll talk about some examples of problems that we've faced and some lessons that we've learned through that process. And we'll leave some time for questions at the end, after this video. So starting with the privacy landscape, I think as anyone watching this video can appreciate, modern companies collect a lot of data, both personal data and business data. And it's really at the heart of everything a company does these days, whether it's an app, a website, direct data collections from individuals. The amount of data coming in is exponentially increasing all the time, which places a lot of risks and costs on businesses. And businesses, particularly when they're starting out, have a difficult time assessing the risks before the data collection happens. And usually the privacy and data handling risks are considered only after a tremendous amount of data has already been collected, which makes it a lot more difficult to make risk decisions around data because you already have this data in your hands and have probably established your systems for collecting, using, retaining data. By the time you take into account the various privacy requirements that you may have or data handling requirements that you establish to help reduce costs and protect your data. So these are a big set of problems for a lot of companies. Can we go to the next slide? And the way that we deal with those problems it has to be a comprehensive approach. And when I say comprehensive, I mean that you can't just have your privacy team or your legal team focused on getting privacy and getting cybersecurity correct. It really has to be a cross-functional effort involving your legal teams, your product teams, engineering, policy, the general employee who learns about good data handling measures. It really has to be an enterprise-wide thing, otherwise you're not going to do it right. And you also have to appreciate that when we say security, it's not the same thing as privacy. Security and securing the data that you collect is a necessary step to maintaining good privacy, but there's a lot else that goes into it. Minimizing what you collect and collecting only what you need and enabling people to exercise their rights. Those are all things that go into privacy as well as securing data and the classic data security piece. That also means that we can't just be focused on data breaches. There are a lot of privacy issues and requirements that don't entail external access or misuse of data, and that has to go into the calculation as well. So how do we approach these issues that I've just described? We've found that there are a number of steps that go into tackling these problems, and they begin with actually defining what data that you have, looking at all of the various types of data that you have and determining based on its sensitivity what type of handling guidelines or standards should apply to that data. Then the next step is actually setting those guidelines so that you know, depending on the sensitivity or risk involved in each data, the level of handling requirements to set, with, of course, the most sensitive data being subject to the most stringent requirements. The next step in the process is actually inventorying your data so that you know all of the data that you have and into which classifications and handling requirements apply across your data. That finally allows you to enforce these guidelines or handling standards that you determine because you know where your data is, what level of sensitivity it is, and what the requirements that attach to that data actually are. Step one is a fundamental step, and it's a very difficult step. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of companies collect data and then worry about the risks involved. And so a lot of companies are faced with the challenge of looking at this a huge amount of data that they have and actually figuring out what data they have, what different types of data that they have, and what level of sensitivity attaches to all of this different levels of data. And when I say sensitivity, I mean pretty much the inherent risks involved in the data you're collecting. That can be very sensitive, things like a social security number, a credit card number, health data, or it can be less sensitive, yet nonetheless personal data that to which requirements apply, things like emails or a user ID or someone's usage history for your app. That obviously presents a very different level of sensitivity than does health data. But once you've looked at all of the different type of data you have, you can break it out into different levels of data so that you can define the different levels of sensitivity and handling requirements that apply. Can we go to the next slide? So you can see here a very basic categorization, tier 1 to 4, with tier 1 being the highest level of sensitivity. And again, that covers things like your social security number, your driver's license, things that are typically defined by law as being the most sensitive categories of data. On the other end, we've got public information, which is the lowest level of sensitivity necessarily, since it's already shared with the world, but which nonetheless will present requirements under law and under your own data handling. So you need to keep that in mind, even if you focus less of your efforts on that than you do on, say, your most sensitive categories of data.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. So as a continuum to this entire process, let me talk about data classification from a holistic perspective. The whole reason we classify data, like Derek mentioned, is to make informed, prudent, quantifiable decisions around how you protect data. If you have data that is, for example, sufficiently aggregated to the point where individuals cannot be identified, or if you have data that is already public, you probably do not want to throw the kitchen sink at protecting that data. It may not make sense. However, if you have data that uniquely identifies someone, for example, in the Uber context, who you are, where you traveled, or who you are, what you ate, and it points out that the data is about you, when you have that level of risk and trust at stake, you want to make sure that you apply the highest levels of classification possible and the most aggressive sorts of access control, deletion, data retention, data minimization controls possible. So if you think about data being classified along several dimensions, there are corresponding dimensions to how you protect the data that classification enables you to do. So at Uber, we put data through the lens of what can we collect, how do we access it, how do we retain, delete, and share it, both from an internal and external perspective, but that is the fruit of the data classification process. So it's not just purely conceptual in nature. So data classification and handling leads us to the third critical step, which is inventory. What we've talked about so far when it comes to data classification may seem a little theoretical. And of course, you have legal, internal audit, engineering, data science, product management, security. But the key is to make those sorts of cross-functional decisions early in the process, so you can then correspondingly tag that data early in the process. So as an example, if your data classification represents tier 1, which is the most sensitive data you might have, underscore government ID, underscore driver's license, that is something that's important because you will want to make important security decisions based on that assessment and that classification. So when do you apply that classification? At what point in the data lifecycle? So if you think about in this slide, your data pipeline being sort of a horizontal funnel. As data comes into your system, it grows based on collection, inferences, copying, models, sharing, buying, etc. When all of that happens, your data size grows from left to right. So you will want to apply these tags to your data as far left as possible, which is as early in the process, which means hopefully before somebody accesses, processes, or shares that data with anyone else. So before any irreversible decisions are made, you will want to try and apply that classification to your data. In other words, apply data inventory. Simply put, data inventory is like building an indexed and searchable database for your data, much like a Google search. I'll let Derek speak to sort of where inventory matters from a larger, big picture regulatory perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Nishant. From a legal perspective, data inventory is so important because there are requirements as well as costs that apply pretty much whenever you're collecting personal data. For example, under the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, there are requirements to delete a person's data upon request, to deliver a copy of their data upon request, and these rights can't be exercised in full if you don't know where all of your data is. You may not delete all the data that a person's entitled to have deleted, or deliver them a complete copy of their data. That one frustrates the intent of laws like GDPR and puts company at risk of non-compliance with those laws, which exposes companies to enormous potential fines and other sanctions. So that's the first reason. But the costs of this data are another reason. Naturally, storing data it costs money. And the more data that you store, the greater those costs. If your inventory is not complete, you may not have visibility into what data you need to hold on to and what data you can delete, and as a result, end up retaining unnecessary amounts of data for long or indefinite period of time when you don't have to, which is both a cost issue as well as, again, a compliance issue when it comes to laws like GDPR.
Perfect. So let me take the cue here and talk about the data inventory system, because for a lot of you, building out that system is where the bulk of the work is, because typically you collect a ton of data, like Derek mentioned, and at a much later stage, you start building out a system once you have a sense of how vast your data is. So at Uber, we had to build a full combined system infrastructure that could crawl databases, that could discover data sets that we didn't know existed in a largely bottoms up environment. We then had to make the metadata available from those data sets and then enable people to add more metadata so we could understand what the data is that we had discovered. So the first challenge is find out where the data lives, then understand what it is, then add more context to it to then get a better understanding and hopefully a better assessment of the classification process. And then, of course, support those categorizations of data. And this is where you can see that the data science team, the marketing teams, the ML teams, and the privacy teams can work together. This is not just something you do for privacy. There is a strong business use case to do the right thing with data. So we have something called the UMS, which is the metadata management service. And it is a key part of our inventory efforts. And as you can see, it places data ingestion and context with overall data governance. So you first want to settle on your classification. You then want to convert that classification to tags and then apply those tags and the policies attendant to those tags at the early point of ingestion the data. So that's hopefully step number 3, which is the very beginning of the funnel that we saw a few slides ago. And then you start ingesting data. So realistically, that may not happen, but this is how you want to get to. This is the level of maturity you want to get to, where the moment you ingest data, you have the tags ready, and then your diagram would look something like this, more or less. Let's look at the UMS backend. As you can see here on the left-hand side, we have the collection part of the data where you collect not just the data itself, but you also collect different structural points, that is crawlers, UIs, APIs that help you discover the data, and you create the metadata and the rules attendant to the data itself. All of that ends up in different classifiers, which are partly manual, partly ML powered. They, of course, learn from each other. And then you apply the initial classification to the data. That is step number 2 in the middle here at the bottom. That then pushes all of that data into a temporary inventory database where you then go through additional checks and then you put final classification tags. We do that at Uber because we want to be certain that our data is as well tagged as possible, given that we care about user trust and safety, and a lot of the data that we can collect from a location perspective is critical for us to protect. And that is why this additional investment is important. That data then ends up again in UMS as classified and inventory data. So to that point, UMS serves as 2 different points of contact for our data: untagged, highly voluminous data, and then the tagged data that is hopefully smaller, leaner, and more reflective of the priority attached to it. So the UMS is Privacy Central, as I mentioned. A quick look at the backend. If you look at all of our infrastructure when it comes to data inventory, the UMS, it has full access to all the ETL pipelines, ranging from the pipelines themselves to real-time and batch data collection, because we do not want to make any assumptions about data and its privacy risks before we discover and classify it. And then, of course, we paid attention to defining metadata, because each individual metadata component will determine the classification that might be applied to the data. So this example on the screen is instructive. A more simple example, or rather a simpler example, would be you could define two different entity types for a location type, value type of GPS coordinate. And if you have 5 decimal points, you could apply entity type as being tier 1, which is somewhat more sensitive. If you have just 2 decimal points, that is much more approximate data, and you could apply a different entity type. And that's how you can apply more custom protections to location data, depending upon how specific it is to a given location based on GPS accuracy. So we're allowing our engineers to have that level of flexibility with the data, as long as we can, with reasonable confidence, tag it. And of course, this is where we explain what our event listeners, crawlers, and API controllers look like in terms of obtaining metadata and making sure that the right classification decisions are made. And then finally, before we jump into some use cases, the different models we have in terms of how we mix ML and human tagging apply for different levels of coverage, accuracy, and performance levels. So you will want to make some trade-offs here depending upon your use cases, or even apply them on a bespoke team basis. Given that context, I want to have Derek talk about how he, as a technical-minded attorney, looks at the success or failure of a privacy program.
Thank you, Nishant. So a couple learnings that we've been able to take away from our experiences at Uber. The first is that you really come to appreciate how much data you have and how much discovery there is that goes into this process. For example, we learned not only about the sheer volume of data that we have, but also more about the types of data that we have. As we started doing the classification and rolling out handling guidelines, we got a lot of feedback from our engineers and from our product teams about different types of data that we didn't appreciate that we collected, or variations on the types of data that we collected. And then we had to address the requirements, the classification level, and other issues that went into that. So there's just a lot of discovery that helps you appreciate the sheer scope of the data that you're collecting. You also realize that there comes a point with your data collection and uses that your costs around this hit an inflection point, meaning that you're collecting or replicating so much data that it presents a threat to the business from a cost perspective. And that's the point generally when the old school way of just collecting data and storing it forever becomes unsustainable, and you really have to adopt data handling guidelines as a way to keep those costs in check. And that leads into a deletion program. One of the upsides of this classification and handling process is that you get a better sense of what data you need to have versus what data you don't. And that data you don't need to have, from both a cost and privacy requirements standpoint, you should be deleting it. And this process facilitates that greatly. Finally, in terms of data quality, as you're taking a closer look at this data, you do discover issues that may be limiting the utility of the data. For example, you might have the same types of data that are named differently in different tables, which limits your ability to use that data or to track that data. And we've had to align and improve our naming conventions, our data quality, et cetera, as we've been going through this process, which of course is useful not just to those of us who are approaching this as a data handling issue, but those such as the data scientists who actually use this data in the course of their work.
Okay, thank you, Derek. So we don't have a whole lot of time, but I want to close with some insights and maybe some homework for this team as a whole, for everybody in the audience. For the last 1/3 of this presentation, Derek and I have put together recommendations on how you can apply some of these privacy controls before data leaves the company. And for us, data sharing is not a conceptual exercise. We have to share data with municipalities, with governments, for example, to study parking infrastructure, enforce traffic laws, what have you. So for us, it's not a choice. We have to apply privacy controls and share data in a way that risk is meaningfully addressed and we protect our customers' trust. So we have looked at how we apply data sharing protections to by way of geolocation, trip telemetry, how you handle IDs, how you handle the processing of the data, how you round off different aspects where data is defined in terms of, for example, pickup and drop off times, GPS locations. We've looked at a limitation use case where, for example, we thought data was sufficiently anonymized, but we could hone it down to something very, very specific in terms of somebody using medical facilities. So there's a voice of caution. We've also discussed K anonymity and L diversity, for example. So we looked at 40,000 trips in Boston, and depending on how we applied decimal points to GPS locations, the trip accuracy varied significantly. So there's a ton of detail here, close partnership with the industry, lots of research. I would strongly recommend diving deep and reaching out to us if there's any questions. We've tried to fit in a lot of content in 20 minutes, and I'd rather speak to this briefly than not have it at all. So with that being said, we're out of time. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much.